Thank you, and thank you for the invite to speak. I wanted to talk, really, to place events of the last few years in a bit of a context of what's been taking place globally, and in particular to talk about the crash of 2008, the events after that, the events leading up to it, and really what's occurred probably over the last 6 months, maybe a bit longer, but a belief that essentially this is now perhaps clearing itself out of the way, certainly in Britain, that although we'd gone through a very deep recession in 2008 into 2009, the worst there since the Great Depression, since the 1930s, and the worst actually essentially anywhere globally since the 1930s, the first sort of genuinely global recession for a good few generations. There's a belief there that things have now sorted themselves out and that everything is kind of back to normal, that we are in fact recovering from this point. So I wanted to talk about that, and I wanted to put things in a context. I want to suggest why perhaps the story of the recovery and a back to normality isn't quite correct. So the crash, well, quickly, this is the context for it, and it's probably fairly familiar for most people. If you think back, and it is 5 years now, in fact it's just over 5 years, since Lehman Brothers, at the time the third, fourth largest investment bank in the US, an immense global financial institution, filed for bankruptcy on 15th September 2008. This had enormous and immediate consequences, obviously for the US. If a major financial institution disappears in your country, then you find that suddenly things look rather rocky. But because it is the US, and because the US banks are immense, and the US itself is immense, this has an immediate impact on the global economy, certainly on the global financial system, leading to, within the space of a week, complete panic across financial markets, a freezing up of the supply of credit and loans globally. As it says there, run on the shadow banking system, the institutions that the various large financial institutions themselves had set up during the preceding period of the boom. This tangle of off-balance sheet activities, the creation of financial innovations of various sorts, notoriously, of course, the collateralized debt obligations that were to play such an important role in the immediate specifics of the crash of 2008, these immensely complicated financial innovations that provided major banks over the preceding boom of perhaps even the decade, certainly 7 years or so, running up to 2008, with the belief that they had resolved most major economic problems, that they could manage risk to an unprecedented extent, that doing something like, and this of course is what they did, doing something like providing sufficient liquidity to enough people that eventually you start providing credit, as in the case of the US, to subprime mortgage holders, to people who were otherwise denied any sort of access to credit markets, that these would be people referred to at the time somewhat flippantly as ninja loans, that these would be people with no income, no job, no assets. But nonetheless, during this expansion of credit in the run-up to the crash of 2008, that the banks believed, the major banks believed, that they could both create credit on such a scale and manage the risks involved with that credit, that it was perfectly all right at some point down the line, through a process of securitizing the risk and the loans, through a belief in the management, through very, very complex technical systems, the employment of people with PhDs in maths and physics, the installation of immense computing power, huge databases of information about individual mortgage holders. The belief that you can manage all this eventually gets you to the point where you start making loans through a series of intermediaries to some of the very poorest people in America, who then get to share in the American dream of home ownership, of of home ownership, of taking part in the prosperity that everybody else has got, even though in many cases these would be people without any form of income whatsoever. And the whole thing works, if it works at all, on the basis that you make loans to people who then obtain a home, and the value of that home increases, so therefore it doesn't matter too much if you're not going to make the payments on this. You've actually got an asset which is increasing in value. So it doesn't matter too much at that point in time, you might think, if you don't actually have any form of income with which to make repayments on the loan you've just taken out on your house. This is the subprime mortgage market. Of course, things turn rapidly sour from about 2005, 2006, when defaults start to happen in subprime mortgages, when the people without any form of income suddenly find, of course, that they can't meet repayments on those mortgages and start to default on a large scale. Now, the issue here is that because you're talking about a financial system that's entangled itself so much in every process of economic life, but in this case has entangled itself deliberately and specifically through the management, first, the creation of credit, second, the management of the risks associated with that credit, in the belief that those risks were now known and valued and therefore could be processed and handled by large institutions like Lehman Brothers, that you could make these loans and therefore the risk could be managed and therefore no crash could occur. This turned out to be, by 2008, entirely and completely wrong, that the apparently sophisticated processes of risk management that enabled banks to take on incredibly dangerous loans like subprime mortgages, that enabled them to take those subprime mortgages, parcel up the risk involved, mix it in with very low-risk forms of credit, particularly US Treasury bonds, and then turn that into another kind of financial asset, which you then declare, and you get the credit rating agencies to declare was very valuable, was in fact both very valuable and relatively low risk. This turned out to be nonsense, and virtually overnight, great swathes of electronic financial assets essentially turned from apparently gold to dust within the space of effectively not much more than a week. This is the effect of the crash of 2008. This is the instant impact of the thing. A freezing of global credit markets, a disappearance of liquidity globally, and an immediate transmission of the recession at the time. So what is the response? You have to understand the response, because the response globally defines where we are now, I think. You have to understand the response, at least in part, as precisely the problem of financialisation, of a growing preponderance, most especially, of course, in Britain and the US, but effectively these two countries, certainly the US, acts as a model for the rest of the developed world at least, that there is a belief that you can allow your financial system to grow, allow your banks in a kind of deregulated and basically very, very uncontrolled environment to expand their operations, that the creation of credit on a grand scale, the development and the deepening of financial markets represents just a good, an unmitigated good, that this is only something with positives, and therefore the more you do it, the better things become. Of course, matched up to this, during the period of the boom, the expansion especially of the developed economies over 2001 into 2007, 2008, it's matched by a belief at the level of theory and at the level of how economics was taught and studied and researched, a belief that alongside this process of financialisation, that most major economic problems have been essentially solved, they've been resolved by a combination of good theory and good policy practice. So that in the case of the UK, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our Finance Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, later to become infamously Prime Minister from 2007, but at the height of the boom, in the mid-2000s, he could quite happily and proudly declare that there would be no return to boom and bust, and he could declare this partly on the basis that if you're in the middle of a boom that appears to be rumbling on without any end, of course, as a politician, you want to be able to tell people that the good times will continue forevermore, But this wasn't just a political trick. This has become hardwired into the teaching and the practice of economics as it is conventionally taught and practiced under the guise of what at the time became called the new macroeconomic consensus, a belief that the sophistication of conventional economic theory was so great that a set of relatively simple rules governing human behaviour led to a set of relatively simple conclusions about the kind of institutions you needed, in particular free markets, independent central banks, and minimal government interference or entanglement with the economy. That if you did all this, you would solve major macroeconomic problems like booms and slumps, like persistent unemployment, that you would look forward to never-ending growth, and that everything in the garden was rosy. So Gordon Brown's populist declaration that there would be no return to boom and bust, and of course similar appeals are made across the developed world at the time, was based on a kind of theoretical underpinning. Beneath that was a reshaping, I think, of how the global economy operated, certainly for that section of it in the Anglo-Saxon world, but spreading more generally into Europe, and at the time, sort of loud declarations that this would be how the rest of the world should run. If it's not quite the end of history, then at the very least there's an assertiveness about an Anglo-Saxon model of how to run capitalism, in which you put finance at the top end, you put major financial institutions in the driver's seat for how your economy operates, your government steps well out of the way, you let free markets run, and for a long period of time this appears to work. Now, the spectacular result of the crash and of the failure of this financialised capitalism in 2008, 2009, of course, is well known to the point of being notorious, that you get governments who had spent the decade previously, if not longer, denying any need for any government intervention at all in any economic process meaningfully, with the partial exception of some well-known so-called market failures, health, education, provision of public transport and roads and some other infrastructure. But aside from that, government should be stepping out of the way. Suddenly, governments are forced, faced with the collapse and disintegration of financial markets, to step in on a massive scale. And the scale of this operation, on the IMF estimate, the scale of the bailouts and the support offered immediately, or at least over the next 12 months, by governments globally, comes to about $11 trillion. Of that, the UK, of course, represents a peculiarly large chunk, because it has a peculiarly large financial system. The bailout there was equivalent to around about 100% of GDP. For America, it was absolutely colossal support offered, but comes to about 30% of GDP. And for most countries with a reasonably developed financial system, you're looking at quite a major chunk, effectively, of your national output being diverted and sent off into a collapsing, disintegrating, otherwise deregulated financial system over the period 2008 to 2009. The other effect, of course, and this is at least predictable from some slightly old-school Keynesian economics, is that if you get a very steep recession, if you get a sudden disappearance, a major shock to the economy, and if nothing else, the crash in 2008 is an extraordinary shock. If you get a major shock to the economy, and your output collapses, you find pretty much immediately that your government deficit, the gap between what the government gets in taxes and what it spends, immediately widens, and that therefore your government debt, the total stock of its borrowing over time, immediately starts to rise. For a very simple reason, which of course, if the output falls, you get less in taxes because there's less activity to be taxed. And if your output falls, you get more unemployment, so you have to pay out more in unemployment benefits. Very obviously, your tax base falls, disintegrates, the amount you're having to spend at the same time expands, you get an immediate expansion of the government deficits, and of course, at the same time, an expansion, a growth of the government debt. The deficit is the contribution to a government's debt over time. You can kind of see this process here for a few EU countries, picking out, not quite randomly, but you've got the Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, essentially very low debt relative, at least, to larger economies like Germany, France, and the UK, shown there in the kind of top section of the graph. You can see the immediate shock over 2007, 2008, 2009, affects pretty much everywhere. Affects the UK very drastically of the larger economies, precisely because it was such a heavily financialised, and still is, a heavily financialised economy. And you can see the impact that takes place across the Baltic states down the bottom there, who go from being a relatively, in fact, comparatively for EU and European countries, very low government debt relative to GDP, which is what the graph is showing, through the shock, a very dramatic increase in the size of the government debt there. And that takes place over the critical years, as you can see, 2007, 2008, 2009, before stabilising somewhat thereafter. The UK, of course, doesn't really stabilise as a continued kind of upwards path of debt over time. So what are the causes of this? Well, this is where you get back into it. And I think understanding the causes gets us into understanding what we might do about it. Because I think the major point here, I suppose, is that the particular issues that had developed and became very, very manifest by 2008, by no later than 2008, by the time of the crash of September that year, didn't appear out of a clear blue sky, that they have a long trace, a long history, back through at least to a series of transformations in capitalism in the West in the 1970s, and a process over the decades since in the changes in how the system operates, that essentially those processes have not particularly altered, that this kind of march from the 70s is still taking place, just with some complications introduced as a result of the crash over the time. So what are the causes? I think it looks a little bit, if you kind of do a headline, it would look a little bit along these lines. The first one is the, and you don't have to start here, but it's not a bad place to start, is the extraordinary expansion of debt since the 1970s, of every kind, of government debt, notably, of course, in the US, but even more so of private sector debt, of debt taken on by private institutions, so households, so you and I, of firms, non-financial corporations, to some extent financial corporations, to a very, very large extent, to an extraordinary extent over this period since the 1970s, connected to a deregulation of the economy, connected to a disintegration of what is sometimes referred to as an embedded liberalism of the post-war period in the West, of the period from, say, 1948 through to about 1972, 1971, of a deliberate attempt to regulate and manage capitalism globally, that becomes unworkable by the 1970s, that produces all sorts of its own problems, associated particularly with a declining growth, with a falling rate of profit for corporations, with increasing distributional conflicts between major groups in society, squabbles, essentially, between labour and capital. And that this whole model starts to break down rather dramatically from really the late 1960s, but unavoidably by the 1970s. And at least part of the response to that is this deliberate, intentional allowing of financial institutions off the leash, of deregulation, of privatisation, particularly in Western Europe, particularly, of course, in the UK again, which is at the leading edge of this sort of thing. The deregulation of financial markets, in the apparent belief that this is both a good in itself, that regulation is simply a bad thing, that it is morally, if you like, bad to have a regulatory frame in which to do any of these things, and that therefore less regulation is just inherently good, and apparently also with a belief that you that you'll free up all sorts of entrepreneurial energy, that you'll give people incentives to get out there and create jobs and invest and all the rest of it. If you allow a space in which the free market can expand, it will deliver bonuses for all the rest of us, and the space, at least by the 2000s, winding forward over the next 30 years, the space that you allow the financial system, financial institutions in particular, is widened very, very much, very, very dramatically from this period of time. The net result of which is, to reduce the story slightly, the extraordinary expansion of debt appearing in the older parts of capitalism in the developed world from the 1970s onwards. Connected to that is the incredible globalization and expansion of global capital flows. This, often just referred to as globalization itself, the appearance of not just national banks but international banks who then own subsidiaries in different countries, who mobilize and monetize and make sure that financial flows can occur on a scale that is, well, it's not completely unprecedented. You can, of course, wind back to a kind of period in capitalist history before the First World War to look at a similar process of globalization of finance, of immense floods of capital and investment spreading globally. You have a period, again, from the 70s where you have this expansion, this entanglement of cross-border flows internationally, and it's connected very directly, of course, to a process of deregulation and expansion of debt and expansion of the financial system more generally. So as the financial system expands, it becomes internationalized, deliberately internationalized. That you have major financial institutions that no longer look just to their home national market, that ideally they see themselves as competing across the entire globe, that there's a continual search for new places to expand this process of financialization and this expansion of finance into globally, and that these institutions become very, very major parts of how the world economy operates, certainly for the older parts of capitalism. Underneath that is the slightly vaguer, but I think nonetheless real process of a kind of neoliberalization of society, which is an ugly word, but this increasing spread of a certain set of beliefs about how a good society should be run, which would make a set of claims about the world, infamously summarised by Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister who died earlier this year, an exceptionally controversial figure in British politics, who said infamously that there was no such thing as society. And what she meant, of course, was that society is just a collection of what you or I or anybody else in this room and anybody else out there chooses to do at any point in time, given their rational self-interests, and that if we happen to work with each other collectively, well, that's fine, but we're not fundamentally social creatures in any sense, that there is no such thing as society. It's just rational consumers making rational choices about what they think is best, and that wider social problems are simply, in the end, best resolved by treating them as problems of personal attitude, personal failings, that there is no role for any kind of wider sense of how society should operate. There is no role, therefore, really, for government beyond the barest minimum provision of services, and that this is connected to a very particular view of society, which governments successively, from the late 1970s, well, the earlier 1970s if you throw in places like Chile, for instance, but from the late 1970s in the developed world, successive governments essentially sign up to a variant of this belief, that they sign up to some variant in the belief that society is something which barely exists at all, that we're just individuals, that the role of government and the state in general should be reduced to a bare minimum, and that the best thing for government to do is, in practice, little more than maybe provide a kind of level playing field for all these free actors in the rest of society to freely determine their own course of action in a market economy, with a market as the sole or ideal regulating instrument throughout. And this changes how society operates, I think. I think it changes people's attitudes to society. It changes people's expectations of what a society might look like. That these sets of beliefs become quite deeply entrenched in how people think about the world. Not perfectly entrenched. They're always contested. It was only ever a minority, certainly in Britain, that really signed up to this sort of thing. But nonetheless, successive governments entrench this as their policy. that there is a continual bias until 2008 to say that any form of collective action against a market is always a little bit dubious, and that there's a set of beliefs about the world start to inform how people behave in society more generally. So this is kind of neoliberal transformation of society, neoliberalism being the common-ish word for this set of beliefs, these set of policies, these sets of attitudes. Now, underneath that, and this is the final one, underneath that, what you actually find from the 70s is, despite the rhetoric of freeing up markets, freeing up entrepreneurship, allowing creativity to flourish, the dynamic of capitalism, the dynamic of the free market, what you find underneath that is that the developed economies, the major, older capitalist economies, are not particularly, their performance is not especially impressive relative to the past. And I'll explain this. This shows the entire world, average annual growth rates divided over periods of 2 decades for 1960, 1980, 1980 to 2000, and then 10 years, 2000 to 2010. The blue bar shows the poorest 4/5, the lower income countries of the world by per capita, GDP per capita. So there's the 4/5 of countries at the lower end, the bottom, 80% of countries by GDP per capita. So it's a less developed world, effectively. And it shows their average annual growth rate for each of those time periods. The red bar shows the developed world, the top 20% by GDP per capita. And what's striking is that, effectively, the 1960s were the golden age, 1960s running to the 1980s, were a kind of golden age for the rich world, at least, in terms of growth, that you had relatively impressive rates of growth over that period of time, that the 1980s to 2000s, this period of an attempt at resolving the crisis of the 1970s through neoliberalism, through the dynamic of the markets and the rest of it, is not particularly impressive for them. And then you get at best a slight recovery over 2000s into 2010, which looks a lot worse from that point as you extend this onwards. For the developed world, the story looks quite different. Everywhere does badly over the 1980s into the 2000s. This is, of course, a period of the third world debt crisis, so-called, serious economic retrogression in places like sub-Saharan Africa, a stumbling of Southern America, limited growth at the time in East Asia, which then by the 2000s has resolved itself into a period of exceptional boom in the less developed world. So in other words, although you get a rhetoric of dynamism, of a restoration of growth for the developed world, for the richer parts of the globe from the 1970s onwards, it's rhetoric and neoliberalism attached to a deregulation of financial systems, it doesn't necessarily produce the results in terms of growth. That the period of a regulated version of capitalism is in fact simply more successful if you're concentrating on the metric of GDP growth over that period of time, and that the balance of the world economy, at least in terms of growth, by the 2000s is shifting towards the less developed world. That the developed world is not recovering its earlier dynamism, and it's subjected to a series, in particular, the shock of 2008. It's not recovering its dynamism, and the dynamic of capitalism is clearly shifting out of the developed world, the older centres of capital accumulation, places in, often referred to as the global north, towards the global south. In countries like China, Brazil and India, very obviously leading the charge in there. So this is the contradiction. The first one is that you get a slowing growth, that the underlying growth in the developed world is not particularly impressive, first. The second is you get a demand for rising returns, that if you have a very deregulated, very large financial system, there is an expectation that it will produce, particularly if it's competing internationally, that it will produce high returns, high and stable returns. That if you're busily chasing around very immediate short-term gains, you want a rapid return on those things. You're not particularly interested in a long-term process of investment. But if you can make a very rapid return then this is so much the better. This is what you can report back to your shareholders. This is what you yourself can claim as your bonus. You can generate enormous capital gains for yourself and your financialized business, that you chase rapid returns. But if you're chasing rapid returns, but growth, the underlying economy, is slowing down or is slower than it was, you're facing quite a serious challenge. You're facing a challenge that's not particularly easily resolved. You need the underlying economy over time to produce the material basis for the rising and high rates of return that you demand in the financial system. There's a contradiction between those two things, essentially resolved by a process of financial innovation, by a process of the invention and creation of new forms of security in the financial system. New, but as it turns out, increasingly risky forms of financial innovation. The other problem that this imposes, I think, is a series of global imbalances, that you get countries that are, in terms of their trade with the rest of the world, producing a surplus, that they're exporting very much more than they're importing, and you get countries on the other side that are importing very much more than they're exporting. A series of global imbalances. The pattern of trade over this period of time becomes increasingly imbalanced over the period, especially of the 2000s. That spectacularly so, of course, in the case of the US and China. The US as a massive deficit country, China as a massive exporting surplus country. That these imbalances are both chronic, they don't appear to be going away, and widening over this period of time, driven, I'd suggest, by this weird dynamic, or this new dynamic of fast growth in the developing world, slower growth in the developed world, and the reverse, of course, of what was taking place over the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And that you get financial flows as the regulating mechanism of this. That this surplus deficit problem, this otherwise very large imbalance and growing imbalance, is glossed over because you have a very large financial system that can essentially pay for deficit countries to continue maintaining their deficit. In the case of Britain, this is very, very apparent, very stark, and absolutely chronic. Britain has run a current account deficit since 1983. It permanently imports more than it exports. It makes good the difference, since it's very hard as a country to always just buy more stuff from the rest of the world than you're selling to the rest of the world. Just a simple accounting problem of accountancy, you have to make good this gap one way or the other. The way it's made good this gap is by borrowing on an immense scale from the rest of the world. So it uses huge financial flows to pay for this underlying lack of dynamism in the economy, this imbalance between imports and exports. And much of the developed world runs something similar to this. The less developed world, the pattern is reversed. But it's a serious imbalance that appears at the time. The immediate response also to the crisis was, of course, austerity. Urged as a solution, certainly inside of Europe, the argument looks slightly different depending on where you go. Urged very much so in Britain. This is despite the fact that, to all intents and purposes, there is no credible or reasonable economic case for the implementation of austerity as a response to a crisis. The fact, well, I'll come on to this, the fact that it has been urged is interesting in itself. The reason I can say with some confidence that no credible economic case exists is fairly simply stated, and I tended to think was something that was well known within economics really since the 1930s, since the Great Depression, and is that classic kind of textbook Keynesian case that if you take the whole economy, every time I spend money, someone else earns money. If you spend money, someone else earns money. I go to the shop, I spend whatever to buy a Mars bar, the shopkeeper gets 80 pence, I get the Mars bar, I spend money, they earn money. If I cut my spending, somebody else has to earn less. If you want a quick and easy explanation of why a recession occurs, it's because people cut spending. If you cut your spending, other people earn less. If you take the whole economy, this has to be the case. So if you've got a recession that's driven by a decline in spending, of course, the government to turn up and say, we must also cut our spending, makes absolutely no economic sense whatsoever. And of course, I think this is fairly widely accepted by this point, after a brief period of time where the IMF, amongst others, was claiming that the impact of government spending cuts on the rest of the economy would be limited. This multiplier effect would be limited. They've now sort of slightly shamefacedly admitted that they seriously underestimated this impact. So I didn't think there was ever a credible economic case for this. The real answer, I think, to the problem of austerity gets you into a problem of political economy. So not just the kind of technical relationships of how an economy functions, but the wider question of who benefits from the functioning of the economy. If economics is about the machinery, the political economy question is who runs the machinery. And the political economy question of austerity, I think, very starkly gets you into a set of beliefs about the world. The first, that broadly speaking, you have governments, particularly in Britain, but elsewhere across Europe, that are still committed to a kind of neoliberal vision, that still do not want to see a state, do not want to see markets interfered with at any particular scale, and that austerity represents a simple continuation of a past set of beliefs, regardless of what the economic theory might be telling you. It represents a kind of ideological continuation of a past set of beliefs. But then more importantly, is that if you're doing austerity, what you're telling the world is that above all else, you're going to protect financial returns. Because above all else, you're saying whoever holds debt, whoever the creditors are, and regardless of the impact on the economy and on wider society, we're going to carry on making sure you get your returns. What it implies is a very clear hierarchy inside the economy of who is most important, who is least important. And at the top are people who hold debt, who are going to be guaranteed their returns regardless of the impact on the wider economy. And then at the bottom are, well, in the case of the UK, all those in receipt of benefits, the disabled, those without work, students. You can continue a list that looks like this. So that's the political economy question of austerity. That it's a good way to secure financial returns. It makes clear what your priorities are inside an economy. It does very little for everybody else. It also gets, some wider kind of, and I think largely, at best, well, it's a bit unfair, but largely ideological issues raised in it to do with how austerity is the key to the long-term transformation of competitiveness, particularly inside the Eurozone. That if we put up with the pain now, we'll have much better functioning, more productive, richer economies at some point in the future. Now, in the case of, for instance, Greece, Southern Europe in general, that at some point in the future, when you're looking at a serious economic collapse, largely induced by austerity, can look a very, very long way off indeed, if it ever returns, if it ever appears. But that is also part of perhaps a longer-term thinking on this one. The key to it, I think, is precisely this belief in a hierarchy of priorities inside the economy. That there was no credible economic case for it, that you had to explain this thing through political economy considerations. For very largely financialised economies, UK and increasingly countries inside the Eurozone, this was about saying we will protect financial returns and returns for holders of financial instruments above the rest of society at this point in time. You then, when this turns into a bit of a problem, you match this by a cheap money policy of one sort or another. Quantitative easing in the UK, eventually the European Central Bank with a series of operations that are effectively illegal under its own constitution, but the creation of very, very cheap credit and the flooding of this cheap credit into the European financial system over 2012 just about helps grease the machinery enough that the impact of austerity is somewhat mitigated. Very tight fiscal policy on one side and a very tight, very loose monetary policy on the other. A bad combination in particular would be to try and apply a tight version of both of these things. This is creating serious problems for yourself. This is a rod for your own back. And so that in general, the approach adopted was very tight fiscal policy. This is the austerity. These are the cuts to spending and the increases in taxation, balanced with, or attempt at balance with, a very cheap, very loose money policy. Interest rates very low, and quantitative easing, or some variant of quantitative easing, the printing of money, the issuance of very, very cheap credit by central banks as a way of making the whole thing work rather better. So, the debt crisis inside Europe, The first one here is that the way to understand the wider crisis, the crisis for Europe over the last few years, is that this wasn't ever a crisis really of sovereign debt. It became an issue of sovereign debt. It did not start as a crisis of sovereign debt. It started, like everywhere else, as a crisis of private finance. It was partially resolved by the issuance of public debt, that the shock of 2008, particularly inside the Eurozone, resulted in very, very large increases in sovereign debt. That sovereign debt was issued by other private financial institutions inside the Eurozone, that this is a very, very deep tangling of public and private issues at that point in time, and that this then generates a second round of the crisis inside the Eurozone and across much of the rest of the world, where you get the issuance of debt by large banks to apparently secure sovereign states like Greece and, to a lesser extent, some of the other southern European countries, in the belief that they won't default on their debts, and therefore in the belief that the debt is safe. And then, when it turns out from 2009 that there is a good chance of sovereign countries defaulting on their debt, a panic across the entirety of the Eurozone. A fusion, really, of a crisis that begins in the private financial sphere, turns into a crisis of public debt over here, and then because the public debt is held by private financial institutions, feeds back into another round of private financial crisis. This, incidentally, is a selection from McKinsey, paper that McKinsey produced last year, which sort of illustrates the point about the debt crisis in general is not one of government debt. A selection of developed countries for which the figures are available, showing total debt. Public debt shown in red, debt of the government shown in red, debt of the private, various private actors, private sectors shown in blue. So that's households, financial corporations, non-financial corporations, shown as a share of GDP. And debt everywhere is high. Japan is an outlier in that it has a very large government debt and therefore pushes itself up to essentially the most heavily indebted economy anywhere in the world. The UK is the next. It's probably overtaken Japan at this point in time due to its overwhelmingly large private sector debt, but you can see everywhere, for which the figures are available, of the large developed economies, that private debt is the real guide to the crisis, is the real guide to the state of their economies, not the public debt. And this is the euro crisis. So, crisis of private debt. Public debt explodes in response. Public debt issued by the private banks, also based inside the Eurozone, also issuing euros, which when you then get the occurrence of the sovereign debt crisis inside of Europe from really October 2009, the election of a new Greek government that opens the books, realises the previous government had been, not to put too fine a point on it, cooking the books, had been fiddling the figures with the connivance, as it happens, of Goldman Sachs, declares this to the world. It sparks off a panic that Greece's debt situation is much worse than feared, ditto for the other pigs, so-called, Portugal, Ireland and Spain, and therefore sparks off the wider European debt crisis. It's a particular crisis because that debt is held by governments but issued by private banks inside the Eurozone. Banks especially in France and Germany, who, if they're faced with a default or even the risk of default from a large debtor like Greece, immediately run into their own crisis. Immediately the European banking system is threatened. And that the mechanism, the driver for the imposition of austerity and the set of decisions taken inside the Eurozone from this point onwards is very largely determined by the need to protect that financial system from the consequences of default. So the bailouts are a mechanism of protecting banks from the consequences of default. The issuance of cheap credit, the imposition of austerity in Greece and the rest of the pigs have this mechanism behind them. That is the euro crisis. And there, why is this a reversion? Because I think there's this threat of systemic change, which was at least opened in 2008. This sudden reappearance after a decade or more of a belief that major economic problems had been solved, that this was as good as it was going to get and this was pretty good, forevermore, that was suddenly thrown into a very, very stark challenge, that the potential in the face of this kind of crisis for doing something different was wide open. But in practice, what happened was a resetting of the system back to essentially where it had been before. That the bailouts didn't change finance. They didn't change how the system operates. They just kept the thing exactly as it was previously. It preserves the status quo. That you get a continuation of neoliberalism by one means or another, and that therefore many of the features of the crisis, many of the features of the elements that drove the crisis have not in any sense been resolved. That you still have a very large and very risk-laden financial system. You have a deep financialisation of society. You have unimpressive rates of growth across much of the developed world, larger developed economies at least, that the imbalances globally remain very largely in place, that you've kind of, to some extent, papered over the cracks, rather. So there's this issue of, therefore, the continuation of the crisis. So what are the alternatives? Well, the alternatives probably, and this is going from the very broad to the slightly smaller, which is, I think the first one, really, you have to talk about the transformation of finance, not just a reform, but a real shift away from seeing a large financial system as a good in itself, from the deregulation of finance, from the allowing of major financial institutions to effectively create risks on a very, very large scale, risks that are then borne, as we know, by wider society, that you want to do something about the appearance of inequality that much of this engenders, the very dramatic rise in inequality across the developed world from the 1980s, early 1980s onwards, that financialisation is good for people who have access to large financial assets. It's less good for everybody else. One side of it is the appearance of large financial assets for those who are already well off. The other side is the appearance of debt in increasing volumes for those who are less well off. It's a mechanism that drives inequality. I'll throw in Iceland there simply as a country that briefly, perhaps, and in response really, driven by necessity, in response to its catastrophic financial crisis of 2009, didn't bail out the banks, allowed major banks to fail, nationalised chunks of those banks in order to protect ordinary depositors, and has, of course, been looking to prosecute some of the bankers involved with some of the more corrupt practices that the boom engendered over that period of time. Driven more by necessity than choice. They simply couldn't afford to bail out their banking system. But there is at least a glimmer of doing something rather different in the face of a financial crisis there. More broadly, I think there's this need to drag us away from a belief that profit alone is, or should be, a guide to decisions about how societies operate and where investment occurs. That there is a need to have a broader concept of what an enterprise is that gets us away from a purely profit-making institution, gets us into talking about wider social goals for enterprises, that there is a need potentially for broadening the concept of ownership of enterprises, that a return to looking at things like cooperative ownership and community ownership of resources, precisely as a way of getting out of a belief that high returns are necessary. Of course, if you're looking for high returns and your rate of growth is low, in the end you're facing a problem. That we can start to look instead at maximising profits, of maximising social returns on investment, and therefore also broadening the concept of ownership of different assets in society, and that a recovery rather than a reversion to type would involve some combination of a broader set of ownerships of technology. I'm thinking here in particular of addressing the pressing needs of the ecological crisis, the need to develop renewable technology and spread and diffuse renewable technology on a wide scale. Gets you into looking at the example, for instance, of Denmark, where community ownership of wind farms is very, very widespread as a means to diffuse technology that is small scale in implementation, but then across a society can become very, very widespread. The need to open wider goals for businesses, and of course the recognition not just of the environment, but of wider social goals for businesses, and not so much a return, but certainly a reassertion of the need to say that business operations do not just sit themselves, without a wider society, that there is a such thing as society, that social goals matter in how businesses operate, that to implement those social goals needs a wider set of beliefs about what a good or effective business should be, and that as part of that, we might also need to address the issue of ownership, that private ownership alone, that the seeking after high and stable rates of return alone are not the most effective or the best means to institute a stable or well-balanced recovery. Okay? That's the end. Thank you very much. That's fine.
Thank you. You've outlined some theoretical alternatives and way forward, but what's your actual expectations for what might happen? I know that the NEF's been deeply involved in promoting the debate and trying to stimulate some new thinking in conventional economics. Those are all great ideas, but in terms of actual reality, what do you think is going to happen? And not just in perhaps the short-term response to the immediate problems currently faced in the global economy, but in terms of a remodelling. I mean, are we facing the end of capitalism as we've known it, or are we simply going to see some refurbishment?
Right, if I'll come back in that directly and quickly. This is sort of slightly speculative about what's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is without anything else changing. What's going to happen is same old, same old. That there is no particular reason to see any major change in how global institutions operate. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, Canadian appointed, just a few months ago, in his last speech made this very, very clear. He said that the crisis of 2008 has been resolved, everything's now back to normal, we've learned a few lessons, dust ourselves down, straight back on to what we were doing before. And he's talking, in that case, about how Britain can once again be a major financial power. Well, it still is, but it can be even more heavily financialised, in the absence of any political pressure. And that, I think, is where the change starts to appear. That we can have lots and lots of people can have lots of good ideas about what you might do instead, but without a fairly serious shift in how politics is established and how the political questions are posed, and without some kind of political force that appears to break that, I don't see very much is going to alter from this point onwards. Now, the problem with saying you don't see very much that's going to alter is, of course, that if many of the conditions, or most of the conditions that produced the crash last time round are still there, other things being equal, you'd anticipate that if you don't hit something on the same scale as 2008, there's good reason to suspect you'll hit at least something quite bad and quite unpleasant within a relatively short space of time. So the future at this point, without some serious political shift, looks like a succession of more or less large crises, more or less unpleasant responses to them, and that's just how things are now going to continue. This is the new normal. It's not a particularly appealing prospect, I think, for most people, but it's the political will that is necessary to break out of that.
Hi, thanks a lot. Jonas Büchel, Institute here in Riga. Off the record from the financial business, I'm not a financial expert, not an economical expert really, only like slight educated. But my main question is coming back to one of the last slides where you're raising a question which is in practical terms very important for the question of this whole forum. You're talking about, go one back please, the community ownership. As a social worker and as somebody who's dealing practically with urbanism, and as a German, coming from a very, very, very deeply rooted cooperative understanding and community ownership country, we are facing the problem in the Baltic states, specifically in Latvia, that we have no idea how, I would say, that we have no real idea yet how to stimulate the idea of community ownership, because there is a threat which is inside the backbone of people here, understandable due to Soviet system and planning economy, that an idea of community ownership is seriously, first of all, something bad and negative. We have some slight development again in the agriculture, that's very nice, but specifically talking also about, for example, the real estate market, where it would be extremely important that we would like face the situation of our large-scale settlements, classic block settlements of Soviet time, that we start to like think about also that there might be a chance not only to build up an LTD in order to control your house, but also a community ownership. So as a financial expert, not explicitly probably a social expert like in praxis like we are, but as a financial expert, do you have an idea how we can stimulate on such a negative kind of platform a drive through more ideas and more positive approach towards the community ownership?
That's extremely good question, and one that I think not just applies in Latvia, but much of the kind of the old Soviet bloc. It's a clear issue that anything, particularly since 1989 and all that anything that starts to speak about a concept of ownership that isn't just, here is neoliberalism, here is the private sector, this is what you do, I think is quite, and you can see why, immediately brings up all sorts of bad associations. My suspicion is, I mean, it's different in Britain. There is some tradition of community and cooperative ownership and this sort of thing. It's different in Western Europe generally, of course. My suspicion is that at least part of this is about having to say that this isn't a reversion. This isn't like, let's look back to the good old days, because they weren't that great. This is about saying, look, this is how the future has to be if it's going to be one that makes any sense for people. And that will involve picking out the good examples of places that are relatively successfully implementing this. That would mean looking to, and I think I flagged up Denmark, but of course, Germany is another example of that. Without saying that, you have to turn yourself into Denmark or Germany or whatever, but at least saying that this isn't about some winding the clock back. This is in fact occurring now and successfully, and these examples can be multiplied. And you can find good, successful examples of cooperative and community ownership right the way across the world. So I think part of it is a simple, little more than a process of kind of education and dissemination and spreading that idea, that we need the case studies, the examples, the demonstrations, the convincing proofs, that this isn't about let's get back to the good old days or anything like that. This is what is happening now. This is what could happen here. And this is how we can start to reproduce good examples in our own society. And that's a case-by-case, piece-by-piece argument. I think it's going to be quite difficult. I think it's relatively difficult everywhere. I think this entrenched set of beliefs about the world, this sort of neoliberalism has eaten its way into people's heads to a very large extent. But if you're faced by what's happened over the last few years, clearly it's not good enough to say go back to that. Clearly it's also not good enough to say go back to the Soviet Union. Well, here's something different. Here's something different that can work. And that, I think, starts to sound like a reasonably convincing argument. Anything else? Ooh. Oh, okay, no problem.
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. Am I on the mic?
Is it on?
Cool. Thanks for the very inspiring talk this morning. I'm coming from Scotland, where I just graduated with the degrees. I think I have the good of both schools, being Eastern European yourself and getting education in Britain. I was wondering if you would find any successful cases of alternative funding institutions or alternative funding structures, because I think the British model might not work here as well, because you have a long historical links and contribution of multiple generations into the generosity, the national generosity, the donating spirit, the communal ownership spirit. The mentality is very different here.
Okay, that's an interesting one, because I don't know. I think this is. Britain, at least historically, has quite a tradition of cooperative ownership of things. The first co-ops, sort of modern co-ops, opened in Rochdale in the 1840s. Tradition of community ownership, much of which has just been completely and comprehensively trashed and broken up in the last 30 years or so, and quite deliberately. The argument was that these things are inefficient, basically a bit pointless, that a kind of market-led regulation of society is just the best way to do things. So I really wouldn't take Britain as a model for anything at all at this point in time. It's not completely bleak. There are some examples where you can think of the development, for instance, of building societies. You know, these are effectively cooperatively owned institutions that provide financing for housing. They're still, you know, there's only one left now actually, but it provides a reasonable chunk of mortgages to people in Britain. There are some small examples where community ownership has enabled the diffusion, the spread of renewable technology. There's a very good place called, I forget its name, it's Green Valleys, it's called, in Wales, where Wales, it's very wet, apart from everything else. I mean, it's very beautiful, but it's very wet. So there's lots and lots of little rivers in the mountains and things. And they've been installing very, very small hydroelectric generators, which are owned by local communities. These are often very, very poor, isolated communities, you know, farming traditionally, that have been battered over many, many years. You let them have the ownership of very small hydro generators on these little streams. It's not big, it's not going to generate huge amounts of money, but it starts to generate enough return back to that community that they have ownership over what's taking place there. They're doing something at the very least to chip away at massive production of you know, greenhouse gases and the rest of it. So they're doing something positive here, and it's been a fairly effective model for spreading on a very local, small-scale basis, a kind of local, small-scale hydroelectric technology. So I think if you can tie together the issue of community ownership and give somebody a kind of practical example, I mean, this is getting down to brass tacks. If you say, you own this thing, you'll get the money from it, that's an incentive, right? And the only way you're going to access ownership of it, because none of you have very much money, is if you own it as a community. That starts to set up an incentive of things. And that might be a kind of example that you'd want to look to. I wouldn't know immediately how that would replicate itself in a kind of Latvian context, but I would guess that there are similar kind of small-scale, very immediate things that can be done, where you can demonstrate a return, where you can demonstrate the advantages, and therefore you can demonstrate why it would work here. Okay. One more or not?